is that so much of your books really is about your sleuth, about March, in a way that MacDonald would never have written about Lou Archer.
Yeah, he was not as revealing about Archer, although, it's my contention that in any first-person novel, and particularly any first-person PI novel, the most interesting character, of course, is the narrator. Right? Everything is mediated through the narrator, and you learn a tremendous amount, I think, about the narrator, just in their language, in what they choose to see, what they choose to focus on, the way in which they focus on. And that's so much of how the characterization is happening. And so it's true. There's a real emotional reticence with Archer. And I actually, another one of my favorite writers, P.D. James, Adam Dalgleish.
Until recently.
Yes, until he found love. But if I had to name some of John March's literary antecedents, Dalgleish would be on that list.
Well, that's the poet thing too.
Yes, and that emotional reticence. But to me, that sort of tension is always fascinating. The tension between somebody who is, who may be by nature a little emotionally reticent, and yet who, has some depths of sensitivity and some depths of perception, and their response to some of the horrible things that they're seeing. And I think that always creates an interesting dynamic of, an emotionally reticent person who's, involved in some very extreme things.
I think it is an interesting dynamic, but you also have to admit that a person who hasn't got relationships is better suited to be out sleuthing at weird hours.
Indeed.
I've always thought that was true about Dalgleish, and of course what we've been seeing in the last 2 or 3 books. Phyllis was 86 when she published this most recent one, and she's been settling him, because she can't have a lot of confidence that she's going to write many more. She can certainly write. She's a tough old gal. I've known her for years, and she certainly might write several more. But I think she's been approaching it sort of as though each one could be the last Dalgleish, and so he's been moving to
a happier place.
I think she didn't want to leave him all alone. And I find that, it's been very interesting. Logically, the scene in the penultimate book where they almost miss connections doesn't make any sense in a world ruled by cell phones and other things. It's like, come on, Phyllis.
But Dalgleish doesn't live in that world.
Exactly. He's been kind of kept back. But you're right. There is an interesting contrast between the emotional distance and being so involved in the case, but a person who was more absorbed in his own life, or hers, as the case may be, because V.I. Warshawski's a little bit like this, would have less time and less enthusiasm for investigating.
A mentally healthy, emotionally healthy, fully integrated person would necessarily be more involved, with their own lives than, with the lives of these strangers who've just walked in off the street. And they would have, connections, emotional connections, and, relationships that place more demands on them. And, people like March, they have very little baggage in that way.
That's very true. It's been interesting to watch Barry Eisler and his John Rain assassin, who was a guy that was like totally alone. Moving forward and and then it's also been interesting to watch Lee Child working to keep Jack Reacher, the guy that rides in on the bus and cleans up Dodge and rides out on the bus.
Nothing more than a toothbrush.
And I just read his new book, and I found it intriguing that Lee has had to go back to Reacher's past for this particular story. He's had to go back to his old Army unit where the whole point of it was connectedness and all.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you've looked at it, but of course at the end comes the question, and now that he's forged this deep connection again with those survivors of that group,
will that be maintained, or
what will he do? And I found that the book went real flat for me at the very end, because what it is he's trying to do with the character actually doesn't work with that story.
That's interesting. I haven't read the most recent one, But that
Whereas
is
Barry chose the other way. Barry chose in his last John Rain, he could see that it wasn't going to work to sever him totally and send him off again. So he turned the other direction. Now he's going to have to deal with what do you do when you take a complete loner assassin like Rain and give him a little baggage, because now he has to. It's that old bit about Superman and Lois Lane,
it's vulnerability. It's a question of vulnerability
for the other person.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, for you, because now you can be blackmailed, hijacked, diverted by peril to someone close to you. And that's always been built into Heroes, hasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely, and particularly, the PI as existential hero, it sort of necessitates this kind of loner, mode. It's, in the case of March, one of the more interesting, things about him, I think, is how self-defeating he is in a lot of ways. He sabotages so many of his relationships when his family is reaching out to him. He at best he's wary. Sometimes he's actually off-putting. The women that he's involved with, he either gets involved with women who are ultimately unavailable because they're married, or women who are so occupied with their own careers that they're asking very little of him, and whenever they ask more, he backs off. And it's a very, he willfully pursues this solitude. And
but unlike these other people, he was married, and it's loss that probably has prompted him into this very protective posture.
Absolutely.
Whereas that's not the case with, say, Reacher and Rain. So I think you've got a guy reacting who was once capable of deep connection.
Or some connection.
Well, that's true. We haven't really explored that, have we?
Than he has now.
That's true. Well, there's another question which I wanted to ask you, because I think it's such an interesting one. As an editor, I have to think about it. When you wrote Black Maps, obviously a very successful book. You won the Shamus Award for Best First, not beating one of my authors. And
Sorry about that.
No, I thought you were the best book of the list, so I can't begrudge it to you. But anyway, you won that award in 2004. You had lots of great reviews, and you necessarily had to start March somewhere, and you had to give him some sort of personality and paint in some sort of background, just because that was like the starting place. But I have often wondered, if what happens to you and to many authors who have to start someplace, and you also have to make them a little complicated and a little interesting, or otherwise, why are we reading this? Is that it seems like almost everyone who does this, who writes more books about such a character, is driven at some point into exploring that backstory. But that backstory was probably, as much as anything, a convenience for getting it all going. And then there you are with it.
I had definitely thought about, March's backstory was not arbitrary when I set out to do Black Maps, and I had definitely given it some thought. And as I've gotten farther into the series and heard feedback from readers and spoken to readers, it's clear. It's become clear to me that I have to explore his backstory in greater depth, because so much of what he is today has to do with what he was back then. And as you said, so much of what he is in response to that. And not only, and we get some intimation of this in Red Cat. It's really not just the events of Upstate and what led to his wife's murder, but even predating that. March was always somewhat troubled. He was troubled as a kid. And that's what made him what he is today. And so inevitably, as he becomes a more interesting character, the questions about, well, how did he get to be this way, become kind of more pressing, and you're moved more to want to explore that.
I'm not sure you could even have explored it at the beginning.
I think that's absolutely true, because no one would care, right? I mean, it's like, okay.
Even you wouldn't.
Exactly. I think that's one of the pleasures of writing a series, is the discovery. And it's also one of the pleasures of reading a series,